A low murmur had filled the foyer of Mitchell Hall as families in dress clothes and Marines in blues moved toward the double doors. But the noise thinned around the older man standing near the wall with a folded program in his hand. His bomber jacket had seen better decades. His boots looked like they had walked too many miles, and the faint hitch in his left leg drew a few sideways glances. A young lance corporal, half curious and half amused, had asked him what every Marine asked any gray-haired stranger near an air station. "You said you were a pilot, right, sir? What was your call sign?" The old man's answer had been quiet enough for just their little group. "Eagle." The lance corporal had laughed, repeated it louder. "Eagle." Just as Lieutenant General Marcus Ellison stepped past, the word hit the general like a flay. He had stopped mid-stride, turned, and studied the man in the worn jacket. "Did you just say your call sign was Eagle 2-1? He asked, and in the space between those words and the answer, the room had gone almost completely still. If you were watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would have loved to know where you were joining us from. Lieutenant General Marcus Dean Ellison had already been in motion long before Eagle drifted through the foyer. At 61 years old, commander of Marine Corps Forces, Pacific, he had walked up the steps of Mitchell Hall with the easy, measured stride of someone who had worn a uniform for more than 40 years. His dress blues had been immaculate, rows of ribbons across his chest, polished shoes clicking on the tile, silver at his temples catching the afternoon light. His purpose that day had been routine on paper: present wings to a class of new Marine aviators, read a citation for a Valor Award, say a few words about service and sacrifice, shake hands, take photos, and move on to the next meeting on a schedule that never seemed to slow. The hall around him had been exactly what he expected: families clutching programs, toddlers in miniature camis, lieutenants standing just a bit too straight. What drew the contrast was the man who shuffled in a few minutes after Ellison, long before Eagle was spoken. Daniel Michael Hayes had been 68 years old, but his face carried at least 10 extra hard years in the deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. A crescent scar along his left jaw bent the corner of his face when he turned his head. Steel gray hair, cut unevenly with a cheap trimmer, stuck out from beneath a frayed ball cap until he removed it at the threshold out of old habit. His pale blue eyes moved constantly. Doors, exits, overhead speakers, as if someone had left a radar set running behind them. His faded jeans and scuffed brown boots did not match the pressed slacks and high heels around him, and the once dark bomber jacket on his shoulders had been rubbed thin near both elbows. The Velcro patch on his chest, Hayes O Eagle 2-1, had been the only sharp thing about him, the letters worn but readable. His left leg dragged just a fraction of an inch each step, shrapnel from a long-ago blast still buried near the knee. But his back stayed almost perfectly straight until pain forced it to relax. He had not simply walked onto base. At the main gate, Sergeant Carla Rodriguez had stepped up, 29 years old, compact and composed in desert mop hat and duty belt. "Afternoon, sir. ID, please," she had said, voice fame but not unkind, one hand near her radio. Hayes had handed over a retired military ID card with edges gone fuzzy and a photo that showed a broader-shouldered man in his 50s. She had checked the list on her clipboard for the Winging and Valor Ceremony, 1400. His name was not there. The rules sitting in her head were as clear as the black watch on her wrist. "So, this event is for invited guests and listed family members. I'm going to need to confirm who you are here to see before I can let you proceed to the hall." He had swallowed, tongue catching the taste of stale coffee and metal in his mouth, and answered with that old disciplined calm. "Just here to see a Marine get his wings, Sergeant." His father was a friend. Rodriguez had shifted her weight, feeling the warm concrete through the soles of her boots and the dry San Diego air on her face. Behind Hayes, cars idled in a slow line. Ahead of him, families moved past with printed passes held up like tickets to another world. She had called his supervisor, Major Trevor Klein, the base protocol officer whose life revolved around schedules and seating charts. After a tight exchange on the radio, they had agreed on a compromise. Hayes could be escorted as far as the foyer of Mitchell Hall, but could not enter the main auditorium without a confirmed sponsor. To him, it had felt like standing one step inside a door that still refused to fully open. Inside the cool air of the foyer, surrounded by polished tile and framed photographs of commanders long retired, the gap between his world and everyone else's had widened. He had taken a seat near a wall, back straight, hands wrapped around a folded program he had been given at the door. The air conditioning had chilled the sweat beneath his shirt, and the faint smell of floor cleaner and coffee clung to the space. His leg throbbed in a steady line from calf to thigh. Each time he adjusted it, the motion had a clipped precision that did not fit a man in second-hand clothes. A pair of young Marines waiting to usher guests had watched him, whispering just loud enough to hear a few words. Chair force, maybe. My uncle says they all claim they were hot shots. One of them had finally stepped over, drawn by curiosity more than malice. You were a pilot, sir? He had asked. Hayes had nodded once. Long time ago. When they tried to tease out details, he had answered with the minimum necessary, but words like SARS, stack, and JTC slipped out, used correctly and without translation, and that had made the younger Marine's eyebrows jump for a second before the moment passed. Then Major Klein had come through the foyer, tall and tight in his service uniform, leather folder tucked under one arm. One glance at Hazy's jacket and boots told Klein everything he thought he needed to know. So, may I ask where you are supposed to be seated? He had said, checking his watch without meaning to. Hayes had met his eyes, shoulders still squared. I do not have a seat, Major. I was hoping to stand in the back. Klein had tightened his jaw. Protocol did not like loose ends. Behind him, families flowed toward the double doors, the smell of perfume and cologne drifting by as names were checked off lists. I am afraid that is not possible, sir, Klein had answered, gesturing subtly toward the exit. We have capacity limits and security requirements. If you are not on the list and do not have a sponsor here to escort you, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the foyer. Around them, a few people had fallen quiet and pretended not to stare. The old man in the bomber jacket had stood slowly, one hand slipping into his pocket to close around a cold metal circle that had never left him, and for the second time that day, he had been pointed toward a door. Daniel Hayes had not always been an almost homeless stranger being ushered toward the exit of a Marine auditorium. For 28 years, from 1983 to 2010, he had lived in the sky above other people's worst days. As a young lieutenant in the United States Air Force, he had strapped into A-10 Warthogs with the 75th Fighter Squadron, learning to fly low and ugly over contested ground. Later, with the 336th Fighter Squadron and F-15E Strike Eagles, he had mastered precision bombing at night and in weather that made other pilots hesitate. By the time he retired as a lieutenant colonel at 53 years old, he had flown hundreds of close air support sorties and had been attached as an air liaison to Marine units in Iraq and Afghanistan who liked to say that when Eagle was overhead, you started planning what you would do when you got home instead of writing your last letters. He had not chosen the call sign Eagle. It had been pinned to him in Alaska during a training exercise when he was 26. A bird had hit his A-10's canopy at low altitude, shattering instruments and gutting half his avionics. With ice building on the wings and his wingman low on fuel, every checklist in his cockpit had wanted him to punch out. Instead, he had climbed solely above the storm layer, flown a manual approach with no heads-up display, and threaded a gap between mountains barely wider than his wings to bring them both down on fumes. In the bar that night, someone had muttered that he flew like an eagle that refused to land until every chick was back in the nest. The name had stuck, shortened to Eagle, then formalized as Eagle 2-1. Over 24 years, Marines and soldiers on the ground had repeated that call sign on radios with a note of relief that no medal could capture. He had built a quiet legend one mission at a time. In 1991, during Operation Iron Bridge along Highway 80, he had led a 4-ship A-10 flight when a sandstorm rolled in ahead of schedule. Visibility had dropped toward zero. AWACS had called off further attacks, and yet a mixed group of 71 Marines and soldiers still fought for their lives near the Kuwait-Iraq border as an armored column pushed toward them. Flying by old-school dead reckoning and the ghostly glow of burning vehicles, Hayes had stayed on station 42 minutes past the time his fuel planner liked, destroying 13 armored vehicles with cannon runs and Maverick missiles while walking a terrified young JTAC through target descriptions that barely cut through static. In 2003, In Anbar province, at a combat outpost named Viper, he had diverted an F-15E flight from a planned strike to drop 2,000-pound reminders that someone was watching over Marines pinned on a ridge, using infrared sensors through dust and smoke until 19 enemy positions went quiet and 5 critically wounded Marines lived long enough for helicopters to reach them. Somewhere along the way, an old A-10 instructor had tapped a photo of a lost squadron and told him, "Your job is simple, kid. Bring them all home. The jets are expendable. They are not." That sentence had dug into him deeper than shrapnel. Then, on October 12, 2006, in Nuristan province, Afghanistan, that motto had collided with the limits of reality. He had launched just after dawn as Eagle 2-1, leading a 2-ship F-15E element task with on-call CAS from a Marine company patrolling near a village code-named Lionsgate. Below them, Captain James Hammer Cole, 34 years old, Marine Company Commander and JTC, moved through a valley carved like a knife wound between forested ridges. Hayes had known Hammer for years. They had traded gallows humor in briefing rooms and shared bad coffee in plywood shacks. The plan that morning had been simple: establish a stack, monitor radios, be ready if someone yelled. Weather had other ideas. Broken clouds clung to jagged peaks, light knifed through gaps in blinding shafts, and the wind pushed dust across the valley floor like a living thing. When Hammer's voice came up on the net, it did not sound like routine. Eagle 2-1. This is Anvil 1. Troops in contact, multiple directions, taking effective fire. Need immediate CAS. Hayes had dropped altitude, the jet's nose tilting toward a valley that suddenly looked narrower and darker than it had on the map. Through the HUD he had seen flashes of muzzle fire along high ridges, ugly orange stutters against gray rock. Smoke curled from a cluster of mud brick compounds near the Marines' position. On the radio, chaos overlapped, shouted grid coordinates, someone yelling for a corpsman, the hard breath of men running under armor-piercing fire. Inside his oxygen mask, his own sweat had smelled sharp and metallic. Hydraulic fluid and warm electronics thickened the cockpit air. His tongue tasted copper where he had bitten the inside of his cheek. "Anvil, say your position," he had called, even as the missile warning growled a low reminder that he was trading altitude for risk. Hammer had given him a grid, Echo 7-2, marked with orange smoke, danger close. Hayes had rolled in, hunting that flicker of orange against dust and rock until he saw it blossom too close to the compounds for comfort. "Cleared hot, Eagle, cleared hot." Hammer's voice had pitched a half-step higher than usual. Hayes had squeezed the trigger, feeling the tiny shudder of the A-frame as the bomb released, then pulled hard, the G-forces crushing his injured leg against the seat and making his vision gray at the edges. He had craned his neck, watching for the impact, seeing only the blossom of gray-brown dust rising over the valley. For a moment, Hammer's voice had returned, breathless but controlled. Good effect. Shift north, multiple positions. We've got wounded. The sentence had been cut in half by a scream. Another voice had grabbed the radio. Higher, less trained. "Eagle, Hammer's hit. Hammer is down." Everything in Hayes's world had narrowed to a few sounds. The shrill tone of a warning light as he dipped below a comfortable altitude, the background roar of wind past the canopy, the sobbing breath of someone near the JTAC's MIC. He had searched the ridgeline, saw the flashing mouths of rifles hosing down the Marines' last known position, and gone back in lower than doctrine liked, ignoring the sharper growl of the missile warning. Dust had smeared the valley into shades of brown and gray. The smell of his own fear tasted like aluminum and old coffee in his mouth. He had stayed there for 6 hours, cycling weapons, directing other aircraft, carving temporary safety out of rock and chaos, while medics tried to save Captain James Cole and failed. When the corpsman's voice finally came over the net with 3 flat words, "He is gone," Hayes had stared at his fuel gauges, the pain in his leg, and the valley that had taken one of the few men who had understood his mantra from the ground side. By the time he limped his damaged jet back to base with shrapnel lodged in his left calf and a hydraulic system full of holes, 4 men were dead: Cole, Lance Corporal Miguel Reyes, Corporal Tyler Boone, Sergeant Lucan, and an Afghan interpreter whose real name he had never learned. Over 120 Marines and Afghan allies had survived. In the 48 hours that followed, he had sat in a debriefing room lit by harsh fluorescent tubes, replaying HUD footage and radio tapes until the smell of burned dust and cordite seemed to leak out of the speakers. Medics had cut his flight suit away and stitched skin around embedded metal, but he had barely noticed. The only time his hand shook had been when a courier handed him a small bag of personal effects retrieved from a valley. Among them, Hammer's battered Landsat compass with Cole 1968 scratched inside the lid and 3 more words carved by a knife point. Bring them all home. When a recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross went up the chain a few weeks later, it had read like a eulogy in a language he no longer trusted. The fall had not come all at once. It had come in steps counted and missed appointments and slammed doors. In the first 6 months, nightmares had woken him 5 nights a week, sweat soaking his t-shirts as Hammer's voice cut off mid-sentence in his dreams. A car backfiring 200 meters away had sent him diving behind his kitchen island before he realized nothing was exploding. His teenage daughter Abby had learned not to sneak up behind him after he spun around once, eyes wild, fists clenched, then spent 20 minutes at the sink scrubbing his hands as if they carried something he could not wash off. The base mental health clinic had prescribed Prazosin, Zoloft, Ambien. The pills dulled edges but blurred the world in ways that made him nervous in the cockpit. He had stopped taking them without telling anyone, poured whiskey into his coffee instead, and told his commanding officer he was fine, so many times the word lost meaning. Between 2007 and 2010, he had watched his circle shrink. He had skipped memorial formations, claiming paperwork, because standing in lines of uniforms listening to names felt like reopening a wound at Echo 72 every time. He had snapped at Karen, his wife of 24 years, when she gently suggested therapy, the words "you were not there" firing out before he could stop them. Abby, 15 years old in 2010, had started closing her bedroom door softly and not inviting friends over because noise in the house made her father pace like a caged animal. Twice in that last year, flight surgeons had pulled him from flying while they evaluated whether his nightmares made him unsafe. When a colonel finally suggested retirement, "You have done more than your share, Dan. Enjoy the good years," all he had heard was, "You are a liability now." He had retired after 28 years, with a small ceremony, a folded flag, a blue velvet box holding his Distinguished Flying Cross from Mountain Gate, and a hollow in his chest where pride used to sit. Civilian life had not caught him. From 2010 to 2014, he had tried to convert decades of combat aviation into a flight instructor's paycheck at a regional airport, but flashbacks did not care about FAA regulations. Once, while demonstrating a stall recovery at 4,000 feet, a flicker of shadow on a hillside below had turned into a Neuriston ridgeline in his mind, and for a terrifying second, he had not remembered which part of the syllabus he was in. He had recovered the airplane just fine. The student had never known, but Hayes had. 3 months later, on March 3, 2014, 8 years almost to the day after Hammer died, an argument over unpaid bills had ended with Karen standing in their bedroom doorway, shoulders shaking, saying, "I love you, but I cannot do this anymore. You need help I cannot give." That night, he had sat on the edge of the bed with an open cardboard box of medals and plaques at his feet. The metal and glass had caught the hall light with small, sharp reflections, but none of them warmed him. He had picked up the Distinguished Flying Cross in its velvet case, weighed it, and felt not a flicker of pride, only the names it did not mention. In the end, he had packed a small duffel with 3 changes of clothes, his flight jacket, Hammer's compass, the blue velvet box, and a squadron photo from 2005 folded to fit his wallet. He had left behind uniforms, plaques, photos on the walls, and 2 people sleeping under the same roof who had waited years for him to come back mentally, not just physically. He had not said goodbye because he had been afraid that if he looked at them, he would not have the nerve to leave. And somewhere in the twisted logic of guilt, leaving seemed like the only way to stop hurting them. From 2015 until 2023, he had lived mostly in the shadow of freeway overpasses near San Diego, the constant roar of I-5 traffic overhead just loud enough to drown out parts of Afghanistan in his head. His primary sleeping spot had been a concrete alcove beneath an on-ramp, where he could press his back to a wall and tuck his duffel under his knees. In 8 years, he had eaten thousands of meals from church basements and soup kitchens, memorized which gas stations did not hassle him for using their bathroom, and learned which dumpsters behind which delis produced sandwiches that were usually only a day old. He had never stolen. He had never panhandled aggressively. His cardboard sign outside a gas station had read only, "Veteran, trying." Word spread among the small homeless community that the gray-haired Air Force guy under the overpass was dangerous if pushed but never started trouble. Once, when a younger man tried to yank his jacket away while he slept, Hayes had woken instantly, grabbed the thief's wrist, and spoken so quietly and so precisely about what he could do with that arm that the jacket had never been touched again. The rumor mill had taken care of the rest. Through all of it, he had kept 2 things clean: Hammer's compass and his own dog tags on a key ring. Every few days, under a weak streetlight, he had opened the compass, wiped dust from the cracked glass with the edge of his shirt, and traced the words "Bring them all home" with his thumb until his fingers stopped shaking. The phrase had turned on him over the years, from a mission to an accusation. On nights when news on a distant radio mentioned another veteran lost to suicide, he had muttered it under his breath with a bitter edge. "Bring them all home. Huh. Did a hell of a job with that." 6 weeks before the ceremony at Miramar, he had walked into Father Thomas O'Leary's church for coffee, hands still numb from a cold morning under the overpass. In the small lobby, the air had smelled of old wood, weak disinfectant, and burnt drip coffee. On a cluttered bulletin board, among flyers for recovery meetings and food drives, a white sheet of paper had been taped slightly crooked. Joint Marine Corps Winging and Valor Ceremony, MCAS Miramar, May 24, 2025, it had read. Beneath the heading, his eyes had caught a name that stopped him mid-sip. Honoring in memory Captain James Hammer Cole, USMC, KA Afghanistan 2006, and celebrating the winging of his son, 1 STLT Ryan Cole, USMC. He had stared at the date, the 24th of May, 2025, and done the math automatically. 19 years since Echo 72. 19 years since Hammer had said over different radio, "In training, same plan as always, Eagle. Bring them all home." Ryan Cole would be 23 years old, a Marine aviator about to pin on gold wings for the first time. For 14 days after that discovery, Hayes had walked past the bulletin board and pretended not to look while his eyes always found the line with Hammer's name. He had argued with himself in circles, one part of him insisting he would only embarrass the kid, another whispering that this might be the only chance left to keep part of his promise. At 68 years old, with an injured leg that ached more every winter and a heart that skipped warnings in the middle of the night, he understood clearly that there were not many more next years coming. The dream that finally pushed him came on a damp night under the overpass, traffic hissing on wet pavement above. He had seen Hammer standing beside him in the concrete alcove, Lensatic compass in hand, the scar on his own jaw itching in the dream's cold air. "You do not get to quit on my kid, too," Hammer had said, voice as sharp as it had been on the radio in 2003. He had woken with that sentence echoing louder than the trucks overhead. The next morning, he had pulled a plastic bus pass out of a wallet pocket where it had sat untouched for 7 years. The pass Father Thomas had pressed into his hand for somewhere you need to go but cannot afford. He had gone to a thrift store, bought the cleanest collared shirt and a pair of slacks that more or less fit, scrubbed his boots in a gas station sink, and accepted a free haircut from a mobile veteran outreach van. He had shaved with a disposable razor until his jaw scar protested in little nicks. At 1,340 hours on May 24, 2025, after 2 bus transfers, 18 miles, and 3 rest breaks on low walls that left his injured leg throbbing, he had stood at the Miramar gate with Hammer's compass in his pocket, old pilot wings pinned to the inside of his jacket when no one could see, and one hope in his chest: to watch a young Marine named Ryan Cole receive his wings without anyone ever knowing that the man under the freeway had once been Eagle. Back in the foyer, after Klein's polite dismissal, Hayes had shuffled toward the glass doors that led to the patio, the smell of coffee and floor wax fading behind him. Through the open crack of one door, warm air and the scent of cut grass and faint jet fuel flowed in, mixing with the cool of the air conditioning. Klein had walked beside him, not grabbing his arm but close enough to make the direction clear. So, if you would like, there was a family center about half a mile down the road streaming the ceremony. You could watch from there, Klein had suggested, checking his watch again. I came to see First Lieutenant Ryan Cole, Hayes had said quietly, eyes sliding toward the edge of the stage visible through the windows. His father was Captain James Cole. Hammer. The name had hung in the space between them like a fragment of a different decade. One of the young ushers nearby had shrugged, not recognizing it, but a gunnery sergeant in his 40s at the other side of the foyer had looked over sharply, eyes narrowing as if trying to match the word to an old story. Hazy's right hand had tightened around the compass in his pocket until the cracked glass pressed against his palm. Klein, drowning in the mental checklist of timings and introductions, had missed the older sergeant's reaction. Yes, well, even so, sir. Without a listed sponsor, he had begun, voice still courteous but more clipped. From deeper inside the hall, a staff sergeant had called his name about a microphone issue, and Klein's patience had thinned. Please, sir. We really needed the foyer clear. Hayes had nodded once, shoulders still square in an unconscious parade rest. He had stepped out onto the patio, feeling the temperature jump as soon as the door closed behind him with a soft thump. At that exact moment, a line of new aviators had moved through the foyer, led by a captain with a stack of certificates in his arm. In the middle of the group walked one STLT Ryan James Cole, 23 years old, dressed blues pressed so sharp they looked like cardboard, gold wings still sitting in a small box in his hand. The light from the glass doors had framed him as he passed. Light brown hair cropped short, blue-green eyes laughing at a joke a friend whispered, nose slightly crooked from an old rugby injury. Hayes, standing just outside, had seen only the backs of the blue coats through the glare. Ryan had not turned. For about 3 seconds, father's friend and son had been separated by less than 6 meters and a pane of glass. Then the doors had swung closed again, muffling the sound of their voices. Hayes had ended up sitting on a low concrete wall about 30 meters from the entrance, the sun warm on the back of his neck, the smell of jet fuel drifting over from the flight line. Through the glass, he could see silhouettes crossing the stage, hear muffled bursts of applause and a Marine band warming up. A breeze had lifted the edges of the program in his hand. He had thumbed the ridged edge of Hammer's compass through the fabric of his jacket, feeling the familiar pressure in his chest that usually meant he would stand, pivot, and walk away before anyone could see him. For 19 years, doors like this had remained half open at best, and he had convinced himself he belonged on the outside looking in. The question pressed heavier than the sun on his shoulders. Was this just another door he would let close on him? Or was this the one where he finally stepped through? Inside the foyer, once the last family had gone through the doors, the noise had dropped. Sergeant Carla Rodriguez had returned from the gate to help with late arrivals, shoulders loosening a little now that the rush had passed. When she had looked through the glass and seen Hayes sitting alone on the wall, jacket collar turned up, hand resting in his pocket, something about his posture had tugged at her. He did not slouch like most people his age. He sat like a man waiting for a briefing that might never come. Lieutenant General Ellison had stepped out from a side corridor then, having finished a quick phone call about some training exercise hundreds of miles away. As he straightened his uniform jacket, he had caught Rodriguez's line of sight. "Sergeant, everything good at the door?" he had asked, his voice carrying easily over the low hum of the air conditioner. "Yes, sir." "Just one individual outside," she had replied, glancing back at the glass. "Retired Air Force," he said. "Name's Hayes. Not on the list." Ellison had followed her gaze. The sun outside had turned the glass into a hazy mirror, but he could make out the silhouette of a man on the low wall, hat off, bomber jacket collar up. Even through the distortion, he could see the straight line of the spine, the angle of the shoulders. It looked like the posture of someone who had stewed countless hours in cockpits and on flight lines. On instinct honed over 35 years in uniform, Ellison had pushed through the door and stepped onto the patio. Warm air hit him immediately, carrying the faint tang of jet fuel and cut grass, muffling the band warming up inside. He had walked toward Hayes, boots scuffing softly on the concrete. Up close, he had seen the scar along the jaw, the pale blue eyes that darted once to check exits even here, the tremor in the man's right hand as he withdrew it from his pocket. His gaze dropped to the Velcro patch on the bomber jacket. Hayes Eagle 2-1. For a heartbeat, Ellison's breath had stalled. That combination of name and call sign had lived in the back of his mind since 2006 like a ghost on a radio net. Afternoon, Ellison had said, tone neutral but curious. I am Marcus Ellison. He had not led with rank yet. Mind if I ask where you got that patch? He had nodded toward the jacket. Hayes had met his eyes with the reflexive directness of an officer talking to another one, even if one of them was still in full uniform, and the other wore a jacket that smelled faintly of old leather and motel soap. Earned it, he had answered. The words came out low and rough, like gravel across metal. His fingers had flexed once against the inside of his pocket, feeling the circle of Hammer's compass. Ellison's next sentence had landed with the weight of a test. Were you Eagle 2-1 over Echo 7-2, New Riston, October 2006? He had asked, each detail precise. Behind him, Rodriguez had gone completely still, eyes flicking between their faces. Inside, through the glass, lights had dimmed as the ceremony's opening video began, blue glow reflecting faintly on the hall walls. For half a second, Hayes' eyes had drifted past the general's shoulder toward the distant whine of jets on the flight line, where the smell of fuel thickened whenever a gust of wind shifted. Then he had looked back, pale blue locking onto gray. His jaw worked once before he nodded. Yes, sir, he had said, the sir landing by old habit. I was. Rodriguez had watched Ellison's face change. The general's shoulders had straightened just a fraction, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. His left hand had closed slowly into a fist at his side. For a moment, he had not looked like a three-star in dress blues. He had looked like a lieutenant colonel again, standing in a dusty command post in Afghanistan. Radio pressed to his ear while a voice called Eagle over a broken net. My Marines walked out of that valley because of you, he had said quietly. Rodriguez had felt the tiny hairs on her arms rise despite the warm air. The patio had gone so still that the faint hiss of the air conditioner exhaust vent 5 meters away had suddenly seemed loud. Inside the hall, the band's opening notes bled faintly through the glass, the contrast between ceremony and this small confrontation sharpening with each second. Daniel Hayes, who had been told minutes earlier that he could not stand in the back of the room, now stood 2 meters from the commander of Marfapak, with a call sign on his chest that had just cracked open 19-year-old memories. Inside, the ceremony had begun without him. Outside, the man who had once been Eagle stood with no ticket and no seat. As soon as he had gone back through the doors, Ellison had moved like a man who had discovered a critical mission out of sequence. Sergeant, get Major Klein. Now, he had said to Rodriguez, who had already reached for her radio. Within 2 minutes, Klein had arrived in a near trot, leather folders still under his arm, eyes flicking from Ellison's face to the patio. Sir, Klein had asked, pulse ticking in his neck. That man out there, Ellison had said, each word measured, is Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Hayes, United States Air Force, retired. Call sign Eagle 2-1. He flew close A support for my battalion at Lions Gate in 2006. If he had not stayed on station, we would have been sending home at least 50 more bodies. He had not raised his voice, but Klein had felt each number land like a slap. Klein's mind had scrambled to reconcile the mental image of Colonel Hayes with the man in faded jeans. So, he is not on any guest list. Protocol requires. Ellison had cut him off with a short slice of his hand. Then protocol is changing, he had said. Find him a seat in the front, not the back. I want him where every Marine in that hall can see him. The general's eyes had softened a fraction. And before you worry about how it looks, Major, remember this. Half the lieutenants in there owe their existence to men who came home because of him. Word had begun to leak even before Klein finished adjusting the seating chart. A staff captain, having overheard, had whispered, "That guy? That is Eagle," to an instructor standing near the doors. The instructor, who had been a young lieutenant in New Riston in 2006, had gone pale, eyes widening. "You are sure?" he had asked, glancing through the glass. Within 5 minutes, the name Eagle had moved from usher to usher, down the side aisles, into the rows where the fresh-minted aviators sat nervously smoothing their cuffs. Dr. Emily Grace Patterson, 41 years old, trauma surgeon and daughter of Sergeant James Patterson, had been seated in the third-row aisle seat, a small gold locket at her throat and a folded program in her lap. She had been there to give a brief talk about battlefield medicine, invited because Ryan's mother taught at the medical school where Emily lectured. When the whispered word Eagle had reached her, carried by a captain leaning over to murmur to his neighbor, her right hand had frozen halfway to her purse. She had heard that call sign since childhood in stories told at the dinner table. The Eagle pilot pulled us out of that mess. Her father had said about Operation Iron Bridge so many times she could have recited his tale by heart. Her fingers had slipped into her pies, closing around a small, worn challenge coin her father had pressed into her hand in 2017 with a rasped instruction. If you ever find him, give him this. As the ceremony's slideshow played on the big screens, photos of smiling student pilots, footage of jets carving contrails through blue sky. Half the audience had watched while the other half had craned their necks toward the foyer doors. Lieutenant General Ellison had taken his seat on the stage for the official opening remarks, but his jaw had been set in a way his aide recognized. The aide had leaned closer. "Sir." There was a change to the program, Ellison had murmured. "We were going to talk about Valor in the abstract. We are not doing it that way anymore." Midway through the ceremony, after an instructor had spoken about training hours and safety records, and before the new pilots came up to receive their wings, Ellison had stepped up to the podium with a different expression than he had worn in rehearsal. The lights had been warm on his face, amplifying the faint sheen of sweat at his temples. The room smelled faintly of coffee gone lukewarm and floor wax, with a thread of starch and aftershave in the air. "Before we continue," he had said, his voice filling the hall without strain, "I needed to recognize someone who was not in your programs." Conversations had faltered instantly. The rustle of programs had gone still. In the very back, a toddler had stopped mid-whisper as if sensing the shift. Out on the patio, Sergeant Rodriguez had opened the door and stepped toward Hayes. "So," she had said softly, that same husky voice she used at the gate now carrying a different weight. "The general would like you to come in." "That is not necessary," Hayes had started, throat dry. The Kool-Aid spilling from the lobby brushed the back of his neck, carrying the hum of the PA system. His hand had wrapped so tightly around Hammer's compass that the cracked glass dug into his skin. "With respect, sir," Rodriguez had replied, standing a little straighter. "This one was an order." Inside, Ellison had continued, eyes moving over the sea of uniforms and dresses. "Some of you have studied case histories of close air support in difficult terrain," he had said. "You have read about pilots who stayed on station longer than their fuel plans liked, in valleys that tried to kill them every time they rolled in. One of those case studies involved a call sign, Eagle 21, in a place called Echo 72, near Eastern Province, in October 2006. In the second row, an older gunnery sergeant had drawn in a sharp breath. The doors at the back had opened then, and Rodriguez had walked in at Hayes' side. The sudden change in temperature hit him. After the warmth outside, the air conditioning washed over him in a cool wave that smelled of recycled air and industrial cleaner. Every scrape of his boots on the aisle carpet sounded louder than the band had 10 minutes earlier. His limp had been pronounced despite the cane Rodriguez had pressed into his hand, but his back stayed straight. Rows of faces turned like a slow tide, mothers with damp eyes, children craning for a better look, lieutenants watching the worn jacket approach with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "This," Ellison had said, stepping down from the podium and moving to the edge of the stage, "is the man behind that call sign." His hand had gestured toward Hayes. "Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Michael Hayes, United States Air Force, retired. Call sign Eagle 21. On October 12, 2006, while wounded, he remained on station over my Marines for 6 hours in a valley that funneled fire like a rifle barrel. Because he refused to leave, more than 120 Marines and Afghan allies walked out of that valley alive." The hall had gone so quiet that the faint hum of the lights overhead suddenly seemed like a noise. No one shuffled. No one coughed. Somewhere near the back, a child had whispered, "Is that him?" and been hushed automatically. Daniel Hayes had stood at the base of the stage, every line of his body broadcasting discomfort, his right hand trembling slightly at his side while his left clutched the compass inside his jacket. Ellison's eyes had held his with a recognition that needed no translation. For years, Ellison had gone on, his voice steady but a shade rougher. People in this room and across our corps have told the story of a pilot they only knew as Eagle. They have used his mission as a training vignette. They have said, if Eagle was overhead, you were going home. Today, I wanted you to see that Eagle was not a myth. He was a man. In that stretch-thin silence, a chair in the third row had scraped softly as Dr. Emily Patterson stood. Her heart beat so hard she felt it in her throat. She held a small, worn coin in her right hand, the metal already warm from her grip. General Ellison, she had called, voice shaking but clear enough to carry. May I say something? Ellison had looked at her, recognized the determination in her hazel eyes, and nodded once. Dr. Patterson, he had said, stepping back from the microphone. Please. She had walked to the aisle, heels clicking on the carpet in a rhythm that seemed to echo off the walls. Turning to face both Hayes and the crowd, she had brought the microphone up. My name is Dr. Emily Grace Patterson, she had said. I'm 41 years old. My father was Sergeant James Patterson, United States Marine Corps. The name had stirred a few nods among older Marines in the audience. She had fixed her gaze on Hayes. He served during Operation Iron Bridge in 1991 along Highway 80. He used to tell us at the dinner table about an A-10 pilot who came through a sandstorm when no one else would. He said the pilot's call sign was Eagle. A low murmur had rolled across the hall, then died down again. Hazy's hands had tightened, knuckles whitening. He had not moved, but Sergeant Rodriguez, standing off to the side, had seen his jaw clench as if he were bracing for turbulence. He came home because of you, Emily had said, her voice cracking for the first time. He married my mother in 1993. They had 3 children, my sisters and me, between 1994 and 1999. He became a firefighter, then a fire chief. He worked in our town for 25 years, trained dozens of younger firefighters, and helped save more people than I could count. He retired in 2015. In 2018, he died peacefully in his sleep at 68 years old, with my mother and all 3 of us by his bed. She had held up the challenge coin then, small and tarnished, catching the overhead lights in dull glints. Before he died, he gave me this, she had said. He had it made for you. She had looked down at the engraving, her eyes blurring for a moment. It says, to Eagle, you gave me 27 more years. Thank you. O.J. Patterson. Every eye in the room had tracked her as she walked down the aisle toward Hayes. The carpet under her shoes had muffled her steps, but to the people watching, each meter felt like a long runway being finally cleared. She had stopped in front of him, close enough to see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the crescent scar on his jaw, the way his chest rose in shallow, rapid breaths. This was supposed to find you, she had whispered into the microphone, but the amplification turned the intimate confession into something everyone heard. She had lowered the mic a little and spoke directly to him, voice softer but still audible. He told me, if you ever find Eagle, you put this in his hand and you tell him he brought me home. So, I am here. She had taken his hand gently, the skin rough and cool, and pressed the coin into his palm, folding his fingers around it. In the second row, one STLT Ryan Cole had stood too, the wings in his own hand catching the light. He had walked toward the aisle almost without realizing it, his heart hammering against the inside of his dress coat. So, he had said, his voice rough as he stepped closer. My father was Captain James Cole. Hammer. His throat had tightened around the last word. You were overhead when the rest had broken apart under the weight of 19 years of imagined conversations. Hazy's fingers had closed around the coin so hard that the ridges bit into his skin. The metal had been warmed from Emily's hand, heavier than its size allowed. His other hand had still clutched Hammer's compass inside his jacket, 2 circles of metal pressed into his palms like anchors. His shoulders had begun to shake in tiny tremors. Ellison, standing a few feet away, had watched those hands tremble and had felt his own eyes sting. Sergeant Rodriguez had swallowed hard, her vision suddenly swimming. Major Klein, who prided himself on keeping ceremonies flawless, had forgotten his schedule entirely. He knew you did everything you could, Ryan had forced out, stepping closer until he stood almost shoulder to shoulder with Emily. My mom told me how he talked about you. Our guardian eagle, he called you. So, if you had not done what you did, I would not be here to wear these wings. He had looked down at the small box in his fingers, then back at Hayes, his blue-green eyes bright with unshed tears. Hayes had tried to answer. His mouth had opened, but no sound had come, only a rough exhale. His chest had lifted in short, shallow breaths, like someone pulling air through a throat full of dust. His weathered face had crumpled, lines around his eyes deepening as tears finally broke free and tracked slowly down his cheeks, cutting through years of sun and wind and exhaust. He had not said I felt ashamed or I felt grateful. He had simply stood there, shaking, gripping the symbols of 2 lives he had changed and 1 he had not saved, while 36 Marines watched the collapse and rebuilding of a man in real time. The coin had slipped from his trembling fingers once and dropped with a tiny metallic ping onto the carpet. The sound, small as it was, had been loud in the silence. Ryan had moved instantly, bending to retrieve it with the instinct of a son who had grown up picking things up for older relatives. He had placed it back in Hazy's palm, closing the older man's fingers around it more firmly this time. Emily's free hand had come up to rest lightly on Hazy's forearm, grounding him. On the stage, Allison's eyes had glistened. Around the hall, reactions had fanned out like ripples. A young corporal in the back row had wiped his nose on his sleeve without caring who saw. A master sergeant with 25 years and had stood slowly, hand moving to his temple in a crisp salute he held long past regulation. In the middle rows, Abby Hayes had sat frozen, eyes wide, every muscle in her shoulders pulled tight as she realized that the man she had watched walk out of her house 11 years earlier was standing at the front of the hall being called Eagle by men who clearly owed him more than a nickname. Taze had blurred her view before she could decide whether to stand or run. This, Allison had said into the microphone, voice thick but controlled, is why some of us still use the phrase bring them all home. Not because we always can. We all know that we cannot. But because men like Colonel Hayes bleed themselves dry trying. And because of that, lives like Sergeant Patterson's and Captain Cole's Marines continue. He had looked directly at Hayes. You did not bring everyone home from that valley, Dan. None of us could have. But you brought many. And we are not going to let you stand outside our doors anymore. He had turned to the crowd. From this day forward, if Colonel Hayes wants a seat in any Marine Corps hall I walk into, he will have one. He earned it 19 years ago. The statement had not been flowery, but it had carried the absolute certainty of a man used to giving orders that stuck. Applause had started hesitantly, a few claps near the front, then had grown, rolling through the hall like a slow, deep wave. Some Marines had kept their hands at their brows, saluting instead of clapping, their expressions raw. Others had simply stood, hands together, the sound building until it seemed to vibrate in the air. The smell of coffee and floor wax had faded into the background behind the sound of a community finally recognizing one of its hidden guardians. At the center of it, Daniel Hayes had stood with a challenge coin and a cracked compass in his hands, tears on his face, Emily Patterson's hand on his sleeve, and Ryan Cole's steady presence at his shoulder, like an echo of Hammer that had finally come home. That evening, after the last family had drifted out and the smell of coffee in the foyer had gone cold and stale, Hayes had found himself sitting on the same low wall outside Mitchell Hall, but the weight in his hands had been different. The challenge coin and Hammer's compass lay in his palms, their metal warming slowly in the cooling air. The sky over Miramar had shifted to a softer blue, streaked with contrails. The air had cooled to around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying a gentler mix of jet fuel, cut grass, and the distant salt of the Pacific. Lieutenant General Allison had walked out without his cover, jacket unbuttoned at the throat, posture looser now that the ceremony's formalities were over. He had sat down beside Hayes, the concrete cool through the thin fabric of his uniform trousers. For a few seconds, neither man had spoken. The traffic hum from a nearby road filled the gap, along with the faint clank of metal from somewhere on the flight line where ground crews still worked. I'm not going to pretend we could fix 19 years in one afternoon, Ellison had said finally, watching a pair of birds wheel overhead. But we could start. He had laid out the plan in specifics, not vague promises. A combat trauma program at the VA had an opening. His office would make sure Hayes's referral went through in days, not months. A bed at a transitional housing facility partnered with the VA would be ready within 72 hours. A staff sergeant with a clipboard and a cell phone already full of contacts would help sort out back pay and missed benefits. Hayes had listened, his thumb running over the engraved words on the coin. You gave me 27 more years, until the letters felt etched into his skin as well. There are plenty of others who need that help more than I do, he had said, voice low. The words tasted like dust and shame. Some of them are alive because of you, Ellison had replied, turning to look at him. Let us return the favor. This is not charity, Colonel. This is a debt. A few minutes later, Ryan had approached with his mother at one side and Abby at the other. The air between the three of them and Hayes had been thick with things unsaid. Ryan's mother had stepped forward first, eyes red from crying. Colonel Hayes, she had said, using his rank as if it might give both of them something solid to stand on. My name is Lisa Cole. I have been hearing your call sign for 19 years. If you ever wondered whether you did enough that day, I need you to know you did. Her voice had trembled. You gave my son a father's legacy and a life he could choose. That is more than enough. Abby had stood a step back at first, hands clenched around a small purse, nails biting into the strap. Her blue eyes, so like his, had studied his face as if she were trying to overlay it with a younger version in old photographs. Finally, she had taken a small step forward and held out a folded scrap of paper that shook just slightly between her fingers. This is my number, she had said. I cannot promise I am ready for a big conversation, but I can promise that if you call, I will pick up. His hand had not been steady when he took the paper, but he had placed it carefully in his wallet alongside the old squadron photo that had survived 8 years in his pocket. That night, instead of riding 2 buses back to the overpass, he had ridden in the passenger seat of a base van to a VA facility 7 miles away. The bed that had felt strange, clean sheets, firm mattress, no rumble of traffic overhead. But when he lay down, the smell of chlorine from the freshly scrubbed bathroom had mingled with the faint scent of industrial detergent on the sheets, and for the first time in at least 10 years, he closed his eyes in a room that had a door he could lock from the inside without worrying about being chased out. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early June 2025, sunlight had slipped through the blinds of a 10 by 12-foot room at a transitional housing facility run in partnership with the VA. The walls were off-white, the floor linoleum, the furnishings simple, a twin bed, a metal dresser, a small desk with a reading lamp. On the desk lay a printed schedule of appointments, trauma group on Mondays and Thursdays, individual therapy on Wednesdays at 1400, physical therapy on Fridays. Hammer's compass and Emily's coins sat side by side on the nightstand, both polished clean. Hazy's bomber jacket hung from a hook by the door, seams mended by a volunteer whose own father had served in Vietnam. He had rolled his left leg off the bed carefully, the old injury stiff but less vicious now that he was not sleeping on concrete. 14 days of regular meals had put a few pounds back on him. The hollows in his cheeks had softened slightly, and the skin under his eyes no longer sagged in gray shadows. His hair had been trimmed evenly. The beard he allowed himself between shaves came in short and neat instead of wild. The room smelled faintly of coffee from a communal pot down the hall and the lemon cleaner they used on the floors. He had gone to group therapy twice a week, sitting in a circle of 8 men and women who all carried their own valleys. The psychologist leading the sessions had deployed twice and did not flinch when someone described blood, or dust, or the stink of burned rubber. In individual sessions, they had walked slowly through Mountain Gate, date, grid, casualties, the way Hammer's voice had cut off. They had talked about the phrase, bring them all home, about how it had turned into a knife he held against his own throat. This time, with prazosin carefully adjusted and someone watching for side effects, sleep had come in 4-hour stretches on some nights, small victories measured in minutes instead of medals. Once a week, he met Ryan for coffee at a shop 1.2 miles from the housing facility. The first meeting had been stiff, filled with talk about aircraft performance, training hours, and the subtle differences between Air Force and Marine culture. The smell of espresso and pastries had wrapped around the table like neutral ground. By the third meeting, Abby had joined them. She had sat across from him, elbows on the table, fingers twisting a hair tie, listening more than she spoke. Slowly, the topics had widened. Hayes had told Ryan about Hammer's awful singing on long convoys, about the way he chewed pens during mission planning. Abby had talked about how it felt to grow up with a father who was physically present but mentally trapped at altitude. Silent spaces still appeared in their conversations, but now there were pauses to breathe, not cliffs he had to jump off. Crowds still made his shoulders lock. Anniversaries on the calendar still lurked like ambush dates. But when nightmares came now, he had somewhere to go in the morning besides the shadow under an overpass. 6 months after the ceremony, by late November 2025, the changes in him would have been almost unrecognizable to anyone who had known only the man with the cardboard sign. He had moved into a small one-bedroom apartment subsidized by a veteran housing program, 3.4 miles from the Miramar main gate. The living room held a second-hand couch, a coffee table with a few dog-eared books on aviation and trauma, and a small shelf bearing exactly 2 framed photos. One was the old squadron picture from 2005, flattened, carefully reprinted despite the original water damage, faces as clear as technology allowed. The other showed Hayes standing between Ryan and Emily in front of the Marine Corps emblem at Mitchell Hall, Ellison's tall frame slightly blurred in the background as he talked to someone off-camera. All 3 in the foreground were laughing at something that had been said just before the shutter clicked. The coin and the compass were visible in Hayes' open hand. 3 days a week, he took a city bus 4.7 miles to a veteran crisis center downtown, where he volunteered as a peace support counselor. His name badge the Red Dan, peace support. Nothing more, but word had already spread among some of the younger Marines that the old Air Force guy understood things that did not fit into pamphlets. His small office smelled of coffee and powdered creamer, with a faint undercurrent of old carpet. On the wall behind his chair hung a simple printout taped up with blue painter's tape. Bring them all home in plain black letters. One afternoon in December, a 24-year-old former Marine corporal named Jackson sat across from him, staring at the floor. Jackson's right leg bounced so fast his boot heel made a steady thump against the chair leg. I have not slept more than an hour at a time in 5 months, he muttered. Every time I close my eyes, I am back in that alley in Fallujah. I do not know how to be normal anymore. The air in the room smelled of coffee and the faint sweat of someone who had walked there from 2 bus stops away. Hayes had listened, fingers idly flipping open Hammer's compass on the desk between them. The familiar click and faint metallic scent of the old instrument grounded him. The green paint on the case had been rubbed to a dull brown in places. The hairline crack in the glass caught the light. I know something about alleys you cannot leave, he had said quietly. He had not given Jackson a war story for shock value. He had given him just enough of mounting gait to let the younger man recognize his own symptoms in an older mirror. He had described 19 years of letting one day define 6,935 that came after. You see that? He had asked, turning the compass so Jackson could read the scratched words inside the lid. Bring them all home. My friend Hammer carved that in. For a long time, I thought it meant I had failed, because I did not bring everyone home. I used it to beat myself bloody in my head. He had paused, watching Jackson's eyes track the letters. Now I think it means something else. It means we keep bringing each other home, off the street, out of bad nights, into rooms like this, even years later, even when we are both lost as hell. Jackson had looked up then, eyes rimmed red, and nodded once. The movement had been small but real. 2 weeks later, Jackson had shown up at Group Sober, with a key in his pocket to a small room at the same transitional facility Hayes had left a month earlier. Progress had not come in cinematic montages. It had come in bus rides, in appointments kept, in phone calls made on nights when the urge to disappear flared. Hayes' nightmares had still ambushed him, especially each October. On the week of October 12, 2026, he had spent 3 days raw and quiet, hands restless, mind looping through the valley again. But he had not reached for a bottle. Instead, he had called his therapist and said, I need an extra session. And then he had gone to the crisis center and sat with 2 younger vets whose hands shook like his did. 6 months after Mitchell Hall, He had walked back through its glass doors again, this time as an invited guest for another winging ceremony. The sun had still bounced off the tan concrete outside. Marines in dress blues had still flowed up the steps, but the man in the bomber jacket had stood inside the foyer, not outside on the wall. His jacket had been clean, seams mended. The Velcro patch, Hayes O Eagle 2-1, had been clearly legible. The challenge coin from James Patterson rested in his right pocket. Hammer's compass warmed his left. When a young lieutenant he did not know had passed and, recognizing his name from a case study, had stopped and said, "Sir, are you Eagle Hayes?" There'd be no laughter in his tone, only awe. Hayes had nodded once, lips curving in a small, wry smile. "Some people used to call me that," he had replied. The hall had smelled of coffee and floor wax again, but this time the scent reminded him of a place he belonged, not a threshold that rejected him. As he had stood near the doors, watching another generation of aviators line up, he had glanced at the printed words on a program in his hand. "Bring them all home" used as the ceremony's theme. The phrase no longer sliced at him. It sat in his chest like a mission he could finally understand. It had once meant risking his life in valleys with bad weather and worse enemy fire. Now it meant showing up in rooms with bad coffee and worse memories, sitting across from young men and women whose eyes looked too much like his in 2007, and refusing to let them face their nights alone. "Bring them all home," he had murmured under his breath, thumb resting on the edge of the coin in his pocket. Not everyone, not always, but one more, and then one more after that. For the first time in 19 years, that felt like a mission he was allowed to accept, for others and, quietly, for himself. Daniel Hayes' story had taught us that sometimes the people carrying the heaviest history were the ones standing just outside the doors, hoping no one would look too closely. His journey had stayed hidden for 19 years, buried under guilt, silence, and an overpass, but it eventually became part of a legacy that reminded us what "bring them all home" could mean long after the shooting stopped. If his story had moved you, if it had reminded you that behind every uniform was a human being still paying the cost in the quiet years, subscribing would have helped us keep sharing stories like his. Another incredible story waited on the screen, about a medic who once believed his service did not matter until a patient came back decades later. Clicking it would have been one small way to honor the hidden heroes and second chances all around us. Every person you passed on the street had a story. Some of them might just have been legendary. Thank you for watching.